On Mount Everest, a warning is not a suggestion. On Mount Everest, if an experienced Sherpa tells you to turn around, then you better do it or else. But when Shriya Shah-Klorfine was given that exact warning, she ignored it. And it gets worse, because that was only one of 4 distinct warnings that she was given before she even reached the summit of Mount Everest. She ignored every single one of them, and at first, she seemed to be rewarded for this. On May 19th, 2012, after nearly 20 hours of climbing through the death zone, Shriya finally pulled herself onto the summit, the highest point on Earth. She had literally mortgaged her house to pay her way here. She had trusted a brand new guiding company that had never successfully put a client on top of Everest, by the way, in order to get here. Shriya had dreamed of this moment since she was 9 years old. And in what must have been the most exciting moment of her life, she paused for a photo, of course. And while you can't fully see her face because of her oxygen mask, you can still tell that she's smiling. For a few minutes, it must have felt like she had proven the entire world wrong, including that overly paranoid Sherpa who had told her to turn around. However, Everest doesn't care if you made it to the top, it only cares if you can get yourself back down. And as Shriya stood there triumphantly on the summit, she had no idea that less than 8 hours later, she would be collapsed in the snow, literally begging her Sherpas to save her. But that's the harshest version of what happened. There's actually another version of that exact same story, a version where Shriya was sold a dream turned nightmare by the Mount Everest industrial complex. And by the time that anyone tried to stop her, they had already taken her money, and it was far too late. Shriya Shah was born on January 11th, 1979 in Kathmandu, Nepal, where, of course, the Himalayan peaks loom in the distance like giants, daring to be climbed almost. When Shriya was 9 years old, her parents actually arranged something very special for her. It was this helicopter tour of the highest parts of the Himalayas, which was actually a pretty rare privilege that most Nepalese children could only dream about. The helicopter lifted off and rose higher and higher, carrying young Shriya towards the mountains that she'd always seen from a distance, but never from like up close, you know? The sun was even rising on Mount Everest as they approached, and the view was breathtaking. The kind of beauty that stays in a child's imagination forever. In this moment, Shriya turned to her parents and she asked them why they weren't climbing the mountain themselves. You know, why people didn't just walk up there like she had just walked up the hills near their home. And her parents explained, of course, that, well, climbing Mount Everest was very difficult. It was also very expensive, and that reaching the summit by foot was something that only very few people in the world could actually accomplish. Oh, and another thing that only a few people in the world actually accomplish is reaching 1 million subscribers on YouTube. I haven't accomplished it yet, but if you look at my numbers, you'll see that I'm really close. And so if you're a repeat viewer, please hit subscribe. And if you're a new viewer, you don't have to do it yet. I'm gonna do my best to earn your subscription by the end of this video. Now, this helicopter ride was like the moment, according to everyone who knew Shriya at least, the moment when the idea of climbing Mount Everest took root. I mean, I can just see 9-year-old Shriya kind of saying to herself, you know, one day I'll do that. One day I'll stand on top of that mountain. When Shriya was 21, she ended up taking a job as an assistant purser on a cruise ship. She was basically drawn to any experiences that would let her see the world, and this particular job was a great way to do just that. And so it was there, somewhere out on the open ocean, that Shriya met a man named Bruce Shah-Klorfine. Bruce was a Canadian citizen who had been working on cruise ships for years as a pianist. He was about a decade older than Shriya, and on paper they pretty much had nothing in common. I mean, Bruce was Jewish, Shriya was Hindu, Bruce was Canadian, Shriya was Nepalese. Bruce had a relatively stable life, and Shriya basically had the complete opposite. And yet, despite all these differences, the couple had an instant connection that transcended all of that. You see, before Shriya's mother had passed away, she had selected a Mumbai doctor for Shriya to marry, like as an arranged partner, but Shriya basically shunned this man completely, and so ultimately, she moved to Canada, and in 2002, she married Bruce. This was a choice that said pretty much everything about who Shriya was. She was someone who would make her own path, even if it meant defying tradition and family plans, and even advice from, close family members. Anyways, the couple would end up settling in Toronto, where Shriya became a fashion buyer while also building her own businesses on the side. She threw herself right into her adopted country with the same intensity that she brought to everything else in her life. For instance, she involved herself in women's organizations, children's groups, and even politics. And this is crazy, politics, because in 2011, she actually ran as a candidate in a local election. Now, she didn't win, but that wasn't really the point. You see, Shriya was never someone who did things, halfway. In that summer, she demonstrated exactly how far she'd go when she believed in something. A friend invited Shriya to a small protest outside of the Ontario legislature. Maybe a dozen people demanding the government do something about high auto insurance costs and rising gas prices. I don't really know, and actually, speaking of that, Shriya didn't really know either. She knew pretty much nothing about these issues, but when the organizers announced that they were staging a hunger strike and would take no food or water until they got a meeting, Shriya immediately joined in. And actually, she didn't just join in, she kind of became the main character. On day 3 of this hunger strike, Shriya collapsed and had to be taken to the hospital. And then a few hours later, when she was released, she was right back on that lawn protesting once again. This hunger strike ended up fizzling out after about 5 days when the police eventually ordered them to clear out or they would all be arrested. But Shriya had shown that when she committed to something, she committed completely, in consequences or even her own health and hydration, well, all of that could be damned. And as much as you have to respect her commitment here, I do hope that you guys out there take your hydration a bit more seriously. I know that's something that I've been trying to do lately, which happens to be why I'm so excited to tell you about Drink Element, who is the best electrolyte company in the game. Element is the sponsor of this video, and what makes them different from all of the other electrolyte drinks that you've seen ads for is that Element has the best electrolyte ratio. Each stick has 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium. And do you notice what it doesn't have? That would be sugar. And that matters because when you're sweating, sodium is the main thing that your body is actually losing, not sugar. A lot of the other electrolyte drink mixes out there just taste like they were designed by a candy company that accidentally heard about hydration one time. But Element is so much different. It's salty, it's simple, and it's made for people who actually sweat, not people with a sweet tooth. I like to keep a few sticks in my backpack or my van or my gym bag because it's honestly one of the easiest ways to stay on top of your hydration. Oh, and by the way, Element just came out with a new flavor called lemonade iced tea, which actually has a little bit of caffeine in it from black tea. And I genuinely cannot wait to try this. And so if any of you have tried it out there, please let me know how it is. And actually, a great way to try it would be to go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. And when you place an order through my link, Element is going to throw in a sample pack with 8 additional sticks for no extra cost. And so one more time, drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. Go get yourself some free elements. And with that said, let's get back to this story. So obviously, Shriya's life was just a complete whirlwind, moving to Canada, marriage, the business, the politics, the hunger strike. But throughout all of that stuff, there was one constant dream that remained. And that, of course, was Mount Everest, the same mountain that she'd seen from the helicopter when she was just 9 years old. The summit that her parents had told her was basically impossible to reach. And so in 2010, Shriya decided that it was time to stop dreaming and time to start climbing. And let's just get this next detail out of the way right now because it's really important. Before 2010, Shriya had exactly 0 experience mountaineering. She had never climbed a significant peak before. She'd never been at high altitude. She'd never tested herself in conditions even remotely similar to what she would face on Mount Everest. But what she did have was determination, a childhood dream, and $100,000 worth of debt that she was willing to take on in order to make that dream happen. Once Shriya set her sights on Mount Everest, the training started. Every single day for almost 2 years, She would run or walk a half marathon, often carrying a heavy pack on her back for a lot of it. She was building the kind of cardiovascular endurance as well as leg strength that would keep her moving at altitude. She also did indoor rock climbing to develop upper body strength, and she also learned the basics when it comes to climbing movements. Shriya maintained this regimen with the same intensity that she brought to everything else in her life, basically sculpting her body into something that could potentially survive the death zone. But here's what she didn't do. As far as I could tell, she didn't actually climb any real mountains. She didn't test herself at altitude to see how her body would respond to oxygen deprivation. She didn't learn the dozens and dozens of technical skills that separate recreational hikers from true mountaineers. Things like how to arrest a fall with an ice axe, or how to navigate crevasse fields, how to read weather patterns at high altitude, or how to manage your oxygen supply over a multi-day climb. Her entire preparation consisted of getting physically fit while hoping that the Everest company she would eventually hire could teach her everything else that she needed to know. And somehow, she found that company, a company called Utmost Adventure Trekking, which was a brand new operation that had literally never successfully guided anyone to Everest's summit before 2012. And so with that, you're probably wondering, why the hell did she choose them then? Shriya chose them through some family connections in Nepal. That was a big part of it. And another big part of it was the price, which was on the lower end. I mean, it probably seemed like a bargain. However, once you add in equipment and airfare, a ton of other expenses, the total bill for Shriya's dream still came out to about $100,000. And that was a lot more money than Shriya had. But she also wasn't going to let that stop her, of course. I mean, not even her husband, Bruce, could persuade her not to do this at this point. I mean, he knew his wife well enough to support her fully. He couldn't talk her out of it. And so ultimately, the couple agreed to take out a second mortgage on their home so that Shriya could pursue this dream. And apparently even that wasn't enough to finance this trip, because Shriya then created a website where she asked for donations and promoted her goal of becoming the first South Asian woman from Canada to summit Mount Everest. And that's kind of a mouthful, but if I was the first person from Rice Memorial High School in Burlington, Vermont, for instance, to summit Mount Everest, I'd probably brag about that forever. But back to Shriya's website, which actually featured a digitally altered photograph of her standing in front of Everest, which was kind of weird. It also included inspirational messages about how nothing is impossible and how even the word impossible says I'm possible. Get it? She also started organizing fundraising events around town, hoping to gather supports and maybe even raise some money for Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children. On the surface, Shriya's Everest campaign was actually building some real momentum. However, it's important to know that behind the scenes, her friends and her family were expressing genuine concerns to her, and they kind of collectively became the first major warning to Shriya, telling her not to go up Mount Everest. But Shriya was Shriya. She was strong-willed, she was determined, she was the kind of person who nearly starved herself to death for a political cause she barely even understood. And so when her Canadian friends and family members expressed doubt about her Everest ambitions, I can imagine that Shriya took them to heart, but she probably didn't take them all that seriously. So warning number one was ignored, and in April of 2012, at 33 years old, Shriya arrived at Everest Base Camp, and she met the company that would be coordinating her dream climb, Utmost Adventure Trekking. Now, Utmost Adventure Trekking's plan was very simple. They were going to teach Shriya everything she needed to know about mountaineering between Base Camp and Camp 4 of Mount Everest, also that by the time she got into the death zone, she would have a little bit of experience climbing at altitude. And if you think about it, this is kind of an insane approach. I mean, I'm no Mount Everest expert, but this feels to me at least like the kind of approach that no reputable guiding company would ever consider. But Utmost Adventure Trekking apparently wasn't exactly a reputable company yet. I mean, they were kind of a startup after all, and they were desperate for clients. They were willing to take on anyone who could pay them. And so to them, the only way to get experienced clients was to just have them gain experience once they got to Everest, which I guess makes a little bit of sense, but I mean, I don't know. Anyways, during her month of training on Mount Everest itself, problems became immediately apparent, and this led to the second warning that Shriya received about her expedition. Again, you have to remember that while she was physically fit, she wasn't just like an amateur climber, she was literally a total beginner. She had to be taught almost everything, including like the most basic things, like how to put on crampons, for instance, and that's something that most climbers are going to learn on smaller mountains well before they even set foot on Everest, but instead, Shriya was learning this literally at the very last minute. It's almost like learning to drive on the Autobahn or learning to swim in like the deep ocean. I mean, it's technically possible, but you're also kind of setting yourself up for disaster. The company's expedition manager, a man named Rishi Raj Kadel, he watched Shriya struggle during training and later admitted, quote, "She's slow. Everyone knew she was slow." But Rishi also said something else that reveals Utmost Adventure Trekking's approach to climbing. He said, quote, "She wasn't sick from altitude, never any headaches. She continued walking." The way that I interpret that, which may or may not be correct, is that he's kind of saying that as long as she wasn't like actively dying during training, then they could consider her fit enough to attempt the summit. And again, that's me editorializing, but like, I don't know how else to read that. Maybe I'm wrong. Now, it's important to note that Shriya's husband, Bruce, who was back home in Toronto, well, he says that his wife never told him about her struggles during training, even though they were, in frequent phone contact throughout her time at Everest Base Camp, which raises another question. Should Utmost Adventure Trekking have called Bruce to like make sure he understood the danger that his wife might be putting herself in? Especially since Shriya was there all alone. It just feels a little weird that Bruce learned about all of these failed training runs and these serious warnings after what I'm about to tell you about had already happened. So this second warning, which was more of like a series of giant red flags, was not only ignored by Shriya, but it was also ignored by most of the people at Utmost Adventure Trekking. And yet, despite all of this, Shriya and the Utmost Adventure Trekking team began their climb, like their actual climb up Mount Everest, feeling oddly confident in their plan. However, just as things were about to get really, really serious, a third warning came right around the time after Shriya had reached Camp 3. You see, when she attempted to climb from Camp 3 up the Lhotse face in order to reach Camp 4, this took her over 7 hours. Now, to be fair, if I were to do this climb, it would probably take about 7,000 hours, but just to put it in perspective, a typical climber does this in under 5 hours. And so being 2 hours slower than average on a training climb is a pretty massive concern. It's a sign that someone just fundamentally is not ready for the challenges ahead. And this is exactly when Utmost Adventure Trekking's most senior Sherpa, aka the most experienced guide that they had, well, he threw in the towel on Shriya's summit hopes. As the date for her summit push approached, he actually changed his mind about guiding Shriya. He told her directly that she would basically be putting her life on the line as well as the lives of her Sherpas, and it was just not safe for anyone for her to actually attempt to summit Mount Everest. And clearly, this wasn't just a casual statement or a gentle suggestion. I mean, it was a direct warning from an experienced mountaineer, a warning that this attempt would likely end in Shriya's death as well as the deaths of those around her. But regardless of this, Utmost Adventure Trekking, faced with a client who'd paid $100,000 and mortgaged her house for this attempt and was now standing on Everest with them, by the way, well, they made a decision that prioritized business over safety. Because the senior Sherpa bailed, Shriya was then assigned to 2 less experienced Sherpas, some younger guides who didn't have the seniority to refuse a paying client the way that the senior Sherpa had. The company's lead guide and managing director, a man named Ganesh Thakuri, decided that he and the senior Sherpa who was signing off from Shriya's expedition would focus on some other clients and their own summit attempts rather than helping their most inexperienced climber. And to be clear, nothing about this is illegal, but it sure feels insane, right? I mean, all I can think was like maybe they were hoping that Shriya would just come to her senses and just give up on summiting Everest before it actually got dangerous. However, if that was what they were thinking, and I don't know that for sure, they clearly didn't know anything about Shriya and her feelings about impossible. They didn't know how stubborn she was, how driven she was to accomplish her goals. Shriya was obviously not going to bail on this attempt, and it was very clear by now that Utmost Adventure Trekking was essentially operating under the idea that the customer was always right, which is usually pretty valid, but on Mount Everest, well, customers turn into casualties just like that. On May 18th, 2012, at 7:30 in the evening, Shriya began her final summit push. And I want to be clear here, according to my research anyways, starting a summit attempt at 7:30 p.m. is already a bit unusual. Most climbers will leave Camp 4 right around midnight. They kind of time their push so that they reach the summit in the morning and then have the entire afternoon to descend before darkness, and also the dropping temperatures. You know, both those things make everything way more dangerous. However, we know that Shriya was very slow, and her Sherpas knew this as well, and so the early start was meant to keep her from getting stuck in the massive traffic jams that had already been plaguing Everest in this particular season. Which, like, as if Shriya wasn't already in some trouble, well, the 2012 climbing season was shaping up to be one of the worst since 1996. And if you know anything about Mount Everest history, you know how much of a deadly disaster the 1996 season was. More than 500 climbers and guides had arrived at base camp by the spring of 2012, all aiming for the same narrow weather window when conditions on the summit would be survivable. And the result was, predictably, bottlenecks on the climbing route where dozens of climbers would wait for hours at critical choke points. Some climbers reported waiting up to 2 hours at one single bottleneck in the death zone of Mount Everest, where 80-mile-per-hour winds blasted them over and over. People became disoriented, exhausted, frostbitten, you name it. I mean, it was just a terrible place to be, and it was no wonder that some climbers ended up just saying to hell with it and turned back. But surprisingly, as Shriya climbed right into all of this chaos with her 2 junior Sherpas beside her, at first she was actually feeling pretty good, like really good. And that's because she was already tapping her supplemental oxygen supply at a slightly higher than usual rate. Her body simply needed more oxygen to function than, you know, more experienced climbers. And while you can probably understand why this is going to be a problem very shortly, this did temporarily give her and her Sherpas some added confidence that maybe she could actually do this damn thing, and maybe she could actually summit Mount Everest. And so while other more experienced climbers began to turn back due to the delays and the brutal winds, Shriya and her Sherpas, they kept pushing forward. This has like all of the markings of an underdog story, right? Which is exactly what makes the 4th warning and what happened after it just so unbelievable. I don't know how else to say it. As Shriya climbed higher and higher through the darkness and the thin air, a man named Ganesh Thakuri was coming down from his own successful summit. Now, Ganesh happened to be the managing director of Utmost Adventure Trekking, and he ran right into Shriya and her young Sherpas on that route near the south summit, which is about 500 feet away from the actual summit. Now, in this brief meeting, Ganesh immediately recognized a problem. And that was that Shriya was almost out of oxygen. Her bottles were nearly empty, and she'd been climbing for close to 17 hours at this point. And she hadn't even gotten through the Hillary step yet, by the way. And so Ganesh was the one who presented the 4th warning to Shriya. He tried to convince her to turn around. When you're in the death zone like this, running out of oxygen isn't just like an inconvenience. It's essentially a funeral invitation. Your brain starts to shut down, your muscles stop responding, your judgment becomes so impaired that you can't even recognize that you're dying. And of course, Ganesh knew all of this. He knew what would happen if Shriya continued on, and so he begged her. He begged her to descend right now while she still had enough oxygen and strength to survive. But Shriya's response was blunt, and by this point in the story, very predictable. She said something along the lines of, "I spent money and my goal is to reach the summit. I will go." Now, technically, Ganesh could have done more to stop Shriya. I mean, he wasn't just a random guide. He was literally the managing director of her expedition company. He could have made the Sherpas, who he was technically in charge of, turn her around. He could have exercised the authority that every guiding company reserves to abort a summit attempt when conditions become too dangerous. There's a lot of things he could have done, but Shriya was just so headstrong that instead Ganesh gave her one more bottle of oxygen, which she cracked open immediately, and then he let her keep climbing. Fourth warning, ignored by Shriya and unenforced by Utmost Adventure Trekking. After almost 20 hours of dragging herself up the mountain, which is nearly twice as long as it should have taken, by the way, Shriya reached the summit of Mount Everest at 2:20 p.m. on May 19th, 2012. And she actually stood up there for almost half an hour, taking in this moment that she dreamed about since she was literally 9 years old, also posing for photographs with the prayer flags and the curvature of the earth visible in the background. I mean, it is an incredible thing. Back at base camp, the expedition manager called Bruce, who was home in Toronto. It was actually 5:30 in the morning there, and so Bruce was awoken by the happy news that his wife had successfully summited. By breakfast, word had spread through Shriya's circle of supporters that she had actually accomplished that seemingly impossible childhood dream, as well as the record she was chasing. I mean, Shriya had become the very first woman of South Asian descent from Canada to summit Mount Everest. She'd proven everyone wrong, like that senior Sherpa who'd quit on her, or the friends who tried to stop her, everyone who doubted that a woman with zero mountaineering experience could mortgage her house and buy her way to the top of the world. All that was left now was for her to get down the mountain. And folks, Shriya was already in trouble before she even started her descent. She'd been in the death zone for almost 20 hours by this point, and her body had just been pushed beyond its limits. She knew that she was about to be in for the fight of her life, but what she didn't know was that she was already screwed, and maybe not even by her own doing. According to Russell Bryce, who is a veteran Everest guide from New Zealand, Utmost Adventure Trekking had simply given Shriya enough oxygen to reach the summit, but not enough for the return trip. And if that's true, I mean, that is just pure incompetence. If Utmost Adventure Trekking really believed that the customer was always right, then they should have loaded Shriya up with enough oxygen to at least stand a chance at making it down. Almost as soon as the descent began, the situation became critical, like super, super fast. According to one of the Sherpas who later testified, quote, "She could stand only if the two of us held her, and that for just a short while, but if she moved her legs, she would fall." And so the Sherpas were now essentially carrying a paralyzed woman down one of the most dangerous mountains on Earth, while hundreds of other climbers squeezed past them on this very narrow route. And, as if it couldn't get any worse, Everest's weather decided to contribute to this nightmare scenario. Strong winds struck Shriya and her Sherpas as darkness crept over the mountain. And it gets worse. Somewhere in all of this chaos, Shriya became disconnected from her oxygen supply, and so without supplemental oxygen at this altitude, death comes very quickly, which at this point may have been the merciful outcome, not one we want, obviously, but you get what I'm saying. The Sherpas kept pushing her along, both physically and verbally, trying to keep her conscious and moving. They placed her arms on their shoulders and helped her walk, but Shriya was just too weak. She kept collapsing, and sometime right around 10 p.m. on May 19th, roughly 27 hours after she'd started climbing, Shriya lay down in the snow and spoke her final words. She said, quote, "Save me." Shriya died less than 1,000 feet from Camp 4 on May 19th, 2012, the same day that she took that smiling picture at the top of Mount Everest. She was draped in a Canadian flag, and then she was left there as the junior Sherpas prioritized saving their own lives at this point instead of bringing her now lifeless body down with them. But folks, despite her death, Shriya did not just disappear or become irrelevant. Actually, quite the opposite happened. Literally the next day, climber Leanne Shuttleworth and her father encountered Shriya's body during their descent from the summit. Shriya was apparently still clipped into the climbing line in the position where she had died, and so these climbers had to maneuver around her in order to continue down the mountain, which is terrible, but not exactly unheard of on Mount Everest. And for 10 days, dozens of more climbers had to do the exact same thing, this horrifying maneuver around Shriya's body, until finally a team of Sherpas recovered her body and brought her down to Camp 2, where eventually a helicopter could attempt retrieval, which is something I want you to think about for a second. I mean, think about how all of those years earlier, 9-year-old Shriya saw the Himalayas up close on that magical helicopter ride, and now this final helicopter ride would seal her fate. But the thing is, the 2012 climbing season wasn't just a disaster for Shriya, but for the entire Mount Everest industry. 3 more people died on Everest the very same day as Shriya, bringing the 2012 season's death toll to 10, which to my knowledge made it the most deadly year on Everest since 1996 up until that point. But unlike in 1996, when the weather was pretty much the main culprit, there was a lot more human impact to point to for these deaths, which for a lot of people was completely inexcusable. The Mount Everest industry had been thrown into scandal year after year, and it all was kind of boiling over now. People needed answers. And maybe even more than that, actually, they needed someone to blame. And this is when things didn't only get complicated, but they actually got quite strange. Now, as soon as the word got out about what happened to Shriya, a media firestorm was unleashed from 2 competing angles. The first angle that emerged in the media was basically that a woman ignores warnings and dies on Everest. And, as I've been kind of emphasizing throughout this video, there's a lot of truth to that angle. I mean, she literally ignored the 4 biggest warnings of her entire life, and she paid the price for it. However, I do want to say that focusing only on Shriya's mistakes ignores a much larger issue here, which is that Utmost Adventure Trekking never should have accepted her as a client in the first place. Again, they were this brand new startup company with no Everest pedigree, and they took on a complete novice with 0 mountaineering experience and promised to teach her everything she needed to know basically at the last minute. To me, that's not guiding. That's tempting Everest to unleash its very worst on your paying client. And folks, that was the second angle that the media discussed. The angle that Utmost Adventure Trekking was to blame for setting Shriya up to fail, which is a very big claim, but I'm not the one who made it. Several Everest experts actually did. Russell Bryce, who actually canceled his own Everest expedition in 2012 out of safety concerns, well, he was brutal in his criticism of Utmost Adventure Trekking, essentially allowing Shriya to climb Everest in the first place. He said that companies should always put saving lives ahead of reaching the summit, and at least to me, Utmost clearly did not grasp that concept well enough to enforce it. Grayson Schaefer, who was a journalist from Outside Magazine, who was also at Everest Base Camp in 2012, pointed out that pairing inexperienced Sherpas with an inexperienced climber was just a terrible decision as well. I mean, any responsible company would have assigned their most experienced guides to Shriya specifically because she needed the support more than a typical climber. But that is not what happened. Instead, when that senior Sherpa basically declined to take Shriya up the mountain, Utmost Adventure Trekking's response was to assign her to junior Sherpas. They overlooked the amateur skills that Shriya displayed during her training and sent her up the mountain anyways, also possibly with insufficient oxygen. And speaking of oxygen, don't forget that when Ganesh met Shriya near the summit and saw that she was running out of oxygen, he responded to her refusal not by exercising his authority to end the climb, but instead by giving her one more bottle of oxygen, essentially enabling her to continue. It seems to me that every step of the way, Utmost Adventure Trekking prioritized getting Shriya to the summit over getting her home alive. They, in combination with Shriya herself, gambled with Shriya's life, and they lost. But this controversy is much larger than just Shriya. The transformation of the world's highest peak into this destination where anyone with enough money can attempt a summit, well, it's created a very toxic situation around the mountain. Companies are competing on price, which means that they're incentivized to cut corners on support and perhaps safety. And it goes deeper because the Nepalese government issues permits to almost anyone who can pay the fee, even if they're maybe not qualified to climb the mountain because, well, those permits fund the tourism ministry. And then on the mountain, traffic jams form these bottlenecks because there's no meaningful restrictions on how many people can attempt the summit during any given weather window. And way up in the death zone, because no Sherpa can physically pull a struggling climber off the mountain, obviously, all they can really do is just recommend that the climber turn around and then deal with whatever that climber's choice is. And it might sound like an easy decision to turn around, you know, when you're hearing about it from the comfort of your own home, but you have to remember when someone has invested like, I don't know, $100,000 and taken out a second mortgage on their house and announced to the world that they're going to summit Everest, I mean, how likely are they to accept defeat on their own, especially when there's someone built like Shriya who had established her dream of climbing Everest at just 9 years old and who had never given up on anything in her entire life. What I'm getting at here is that this entire system creates the perfect conditions for people like Shriya, very headstrong, stubborn people, to die, and then very often it blames them, the victims, for ignoring warnings when those warnings came far too late and often from the wrong people. And look, none of this is to absolve Shriya of any responsibility. I think she's equally as responsible as Utmost Adventure Trekking, but just remember, if Utmost Adventure Trekking had refused her as a client, which they probably should have, if regulations prevented total novices from attempting Everest, if traffic management prevented the bottlenecks that had depleted Shriya's oxygen supply, if all of those things hadn't happened, then she would probably still be alive today. You would think that Shriya's death might be a huge wake-up call for the Mount Everest industrial complex, but unfortunately it wasn't. The traffic jams continued, more novice climbers paid their fees and started their summit attempts, more companies took on clients that they probably shouldn't have accepted, and of course, more people died chasing dreams on a mountain that's pretty much become a business instead of a challenge. Oh, and get this, apparently Utmost Adventure Trekking still operates to this day, and I have to believe it's now under some new management, or at the very least has some better policies. Look, the truth is that Shriya bought her way onto Mount Everest, and then Everest took everything from her. Her money, her dreams, and then finally her life. And whether that's a story about personal stubbornness or industry negligence or both, well, that depends on which part of the tragedy you focus on. The customer ignored 4 giant warnings that she should have heeded, and that customer was also failed by an operator that never should have put her on that mountain in the first place. My heart goes out to Shriya, all of her friends, and her family. Please show her some love in the comments. If you're gonna criticize her, I get it, but just do so respectfully, please. And also remember, it's much easier to discuss these things and criticize decisions when you're down at sea level like we are versus when you're up at altitude. I had a lot of help on this video from a documentary that you can watch called The Fifth Estate. I will have a link to it in the description. It's not only full of interviews about Shriya's climb, but it also shows real footage from her climb, and you can even hear from Shriya herself before everything went wrong, which is really cool. And so go check it out. And if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and subscribe. If you're a new viewer, I hope I earned your subscription. Again, we're trying to get to 1 million subscribers this year, and we're so close. None of it is possible without you guys. YouTube seems to think you'll like this video next, and so give it a click, and I'll see all of you over there.